In this first video, we'll learn how to select geometry and control the visibility of it, so we can then paint into hard-to-reach areas on our models. Alright, great. So you can see I've loaded up our Assassin Final project again. This is the one with all of the textures already inside of it here. And I want to talk to you a little bit about making selections here inside of MARI. So the main tool you're going to use for this is this very top one here inside your toolbar. It's called your Select Items tool. You can see I mouse over it and it just says Select Items. Now by default with a project like this one that is based on a UV layout, you should be set to what is known as patch selection mode. So the first thing you'll want to make sure you have available to you, if we come over here and click, is this selection toolbar. Now this selection toolbar appears right here. It's these three options, and you can see the middle option is pressed in, indicating that we're using patch selection mode. So what this means is that I can come in here and I can simply make a selection of patches by either clicking or by clicking and dragging. So notice that by clicking I selected that piece of armor right there. Now if I came over and looked at the UV view, you can see where that patch is along with all the rest of the UVs. But we can also come over here and make a selection. So let's go ahead and click and drag. And you can see right now I'm dragging kind of a marquee selection. And what I've selected here are numerous patches. And we can come over to that UV view again and we can see where all those patches live. Now, I used a marquee style selection to click and drag with, and that's up here in the Tool Properties toolbar. You can see there are actually four options here. Really only three of these pertains to patch selections in my mind. I can also use a lasso style technique to do this. So if I were to click away and deselect those patches, and maybe I wanted to come in here and make a selection sort of like this, we could use the lasso style of making that selection rather than the marquee style. And again, there's a third one here for polygonal type selections. So if we came over here, made a selection sort of like that, there we go. You can see every patch that was inside that particular selection was selected. So I will typically stick to either lasso or to the marquee style of selection, especially when I'm working with patches here. But notice here that when I made this type of selection here, what was selected was only the things that were inside the selection that were visible to the camera. So notice that I did not actually get the pants selected here. Now, we could actually change the facing mode up here in the Tool Properties bar. Right now it's set to front, but if we came over and switched this to through, what this means is anything that lives inside that selection, whether the camera can see it or not, is going to be selected. So watch what happens now. If I come in and make a selection like that, we should get the pants as well, because the pants were technically inside that selection area. They were just behind the arm. Alright, great. Now this can be very, very useful, but it is something you do need to remember you have turned on. So I'm going to make sure and turn mine off just like so. Now we can also add to and subtract from selections. Say if I had this piece of armor selected and I wanted to also select the knife. If I were to hold the Shift key down, you can see there's a little plus sign that appears next to my cursor, and we can start to come in and add to a selection by holding down the Shift key. Now, if I accidentally got the body mesh and I didn't want that, we could also subtract from a selection by holding the Control key down. So if I were to simply click on the arm there, you can see we could subtract that selection. Now, this is patch selection mode. Very, very useful, but it's not going to be as measurably useful in all situations. In this particular instance, this asset has been really divided up well into different patches and UDIM numbers. So if you're working on maybe a games asset or something like that, though, you may have all of the asset in a single texture space. And if that was the case, then patch selection isn't going to do much for you. Now, what I want to introduce you to here is face selection mode. That's going to be this button right over here. Now, this first one here is one I use very infrequently. This is called object selection, and in the case of this object, it's just going to select the entire asset, because if you remember, when we created this project, we only loaded in one MARI object. But if you had a project that had multiple objects loaded in, this would become useful for you, because you could then select between the objects. So let's talk about this face selection mode here. I'm going to click away, make sure I don't have anything selected here, and I'm going to stick here with lasso selection. And again, I'm just selecting the front. So if I made a lasso selection right about there, what you're going to see happen is I'm going to select all of the polygons that fall inside that selection area. And if I was to zoom in and look at that pretty closely, you can see, again, that's a pretty high resolution mesh. We got lots and lots of polygons selected there. But it's not by any means all of the polygons that were in that. We had some of those faces that were not oriented towards the camera, so we weren't able to see them and to select them. So when I'm using face mode like this, let me just switch to the UV view, because this becomes really apparent. We'll just zoom in on that same patch here. So what I like to do when I'm using face mode is I like to select individual shells. Say, for example, I just wanted to work on this plate right here. I didn't want to have to worry about messing up the paint that I'd already done on these little rivets or any of these other plates that are located on this patch. What I could use is this smart selection mode right here. And again, I'll go back to my UV view and just simply click using smart selection. And what MARI is going to do is it's going to automatically detect where that shell is, or where the boundaries of that particular UV is. And you can see here that it's only selected that particular mesh. So if we came back over here and zoomed out, you'd be able to see that the entirety of this is selected. Now, this is such a high resolution mesh that switching to my paintbrush, I'll just go ahead and switch over to that really quickly. You can see right now it's going to be a little hard to see what I'm painting on because all of the edges are highlighted in the mesh. So this is where using your display properties comes in handy. And we can kind of control how things are rendered here. So how things are filled and how things are outlined. Right now we're always outlining. I'm going to set that to never. And now you can see that highlighting went away, and I can now paint on just this particular part of the asset and not worry about any of those green lines in the way. So I'm going to set that back over to always just to leave things at their default here. Now, in talking about limiting a paint selection or limiting a paintable area, this is actually kind of a double-edged sword. We need to make a selection of what we want to paint, but there's also an option over here in the projection palette. If we come over here, this project on by default is set to all. I typically will set this to selected only. What that'll do is it'll allow me to make sure that I'm only painting on the areas that I have selected. Now, what if I wanted to paint the arm underneath that particular piece of geometry? Well, I have those faces selected here. What I could do is I could come up here to the selection menu. And you can see here that there are a number of hiding and showing options. So I could just come in here and hide the selected. And you can see what happens here is that particular part of this shell gets hidden. Now, another way that you can access that is by right-clicking away from the mesh. And you can see there are some visibility options here. Now, just because I've hidden that particular piece of the asset doesn't mean that it's not selected anymore. If I were to come over to visibility and choose show selected, it would come back, as you can see here. But combining these different selection modes, both face and patch selection, with the visibility options, it really lets you come in here and begin to control where you're able to paint for an asset like this. So again, this is something that I use all the time, are different ways to select geometry and then hide geometry. So what I could do here, if I wanted to, for example, just work on the skin areas, I could select maybe the head and the body, and I could come over here to my visibility options and choose to hide the unselected. And you can see here, by doing that, it hides everything except for those two patches that I had selected. So that way we can come in here and work just on those. And if we ever wanted to bring them back, or bring back the rest of the asset, we could just go to Show All. And all of the pieces come back. All right, great. So in this video, we've learned how to make a number of different types of selections, as well as control the visibility of the different pieces of our assets.